November 1986. A small magazine in Beirut, Lebanon, publishes a story that most of the world has never heard of. Within days, it will reach Washington. Within weeks, it will put the President of the United States on television, denying something that turns out to be true. Within a year, it will trigger one of the largest congressional investigations in American history, bigger, in some ways, than people remember Watergate being at the time. The story sounds almost too strange to be real. The United States government, publicly committed to never negotiating with terrorists, secretly sold weapons to Iran, a country it had labeled a state sponsor of terrorism, in a bid to free American hostages. Then it took the profits from those secret weapons sales and used them to fund a guerrilla war in Central America that Congress had explicitly voted to stop funding. 2 illegal operations. Run out of the basement of the White House. By a Marine lieutenant colonel most Americans had never heard of. This is the story of Iran-Contra. And by the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened, but why it almost ended Ronald Reagan's presidency, and why so many of the same names kept reappearing in American politics for decades afterward. To understand Iran-Contra, you need to understand 2 separate crises happening at the same time, on opposite sides of the globe, that had nothing to do with each other, until one man decided to connect them. By the mid-1980s, Lebanon was in the middle of a brutal civil war, and a wave of kidnappings had swept through Beirut. American citizens, journalists, professors, a CIA station chief, were being taken by militant groups with ties to Iran, most notably a group called Hezbollah, which was just emerging as a major force in the region. By 1985, 7 Americans were being held hostage in Lebanon. Their families were on television, pleading for their release. It was a political nightmare for President Reagan, who had built part of his image on being tough on terrorism. His administration had a public, official policy: the United States does not negotiate with terrorists. Full stop. Privately, that policy was about to be tested. Meanwhile, Iran was 5 years into a brutal war with Iraq, a war that would eventually kill roughly 500,000 to 1 million people on both sides combined. Iran was desperate for weapons and spare parts, especially for American-made military equipment it had purchased back when the US-backed Shah still ruled the country. But since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis at the US Embassy in Tehran, the United States had cut off arms sales to Iran entirely. Iran was isolated, at war, and running low on the parts it needed to keep its American-built jets and missile systems running. Some people inside the Reagan administration saw an opportunity in that desperation. Thousands of miles away, in Nicaragua, a leftist government called the Sandinistas had taken power in 1979 after overthrowing a US-backed dictator. The Reagan administration viewed the Sandinistas as a Soviet and Cuban-aligned threat in America's backyard, the same domino theory fear that had driven US policy in Vietnam. To counter them, the CIA began arming and training a rebel group known as the Contras, short for Contrarrevolucionarios, or counter-revolutionaries. Reagan called them the moral equal of our founding fathers. Critics called them a brutal paramilitary force with a documented record of human rights abuses. Congress was deeply divided. And in 1982, and again more strictly in 1984, Congress passed something called the Boland Amendment, legislation that banned the CIA and the Department of Defense from providing military aid to the Contras. 3 separate crises. A hostage problem in Lebanon. An arms-starved Iran fighting a war. A rebel army in Nicaragua that Congress had just cut off. On paper, none of these problems touched each other. Then, inside the White House basement, someone found a way to connect all 3, and solve all 3 problems at once, illegally. In 1985, a group of Reagan administration officials, including National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, and later his successor John Poindexter, began exploring a secret plan. If the US quietly sold weapons to Iran through an intermediary, the theory went, moderate elements within the Iranian government might use their influence with Hezbollah in Lebanon to secure the release of American hostages. It violated the US arms embargo on Iran. It violated the stated policy of never negotiating with terrorists. And crucially, it required Israel, which had its own complicated, quiet relationship with Iran, to serve as the middleman. Here's how it worked: in simplified form, the United States would sell weapons to Israel. Israel would then ship those same weapons, often TOW anti-tank missiles and parts for Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, on to Iran. The U.S. would then replenish Israel's stockpile. Iran got weapons it desperately needed for its war with Iraq. Israel got to maintain a back-channel relationship with a neighboring power. And in exchange, Iran was supposed to lean on the Lebanese militants to free the American hostages. The first shipments went out in the summer of 1985. And here's the part that becomes crucial later: on at least one occasion, a hostage actually was released not long after a shipment, the Reverend Benjamin Weir, freed in September 1985. It looked, to the people running the operation, like it was working. By early 1986, the operation had a new operator running the daily logistics, a Marine lieutenant colonel on the National Security Council staff named Oliver North. North was smart, fiercely loyal to Reagan, and, by his own later admission, willing to bend and break the law if he believed it served what he saw as the national interest. North didn't just manage the arms shipments. He built out what insiders would later call the Enterprise, a private network of retired military officers, arms dealers, and secret Swiss bank accounts, run almost entirely outside the normal channels of the CIA or the Pentagon. It had its own pilots, its own airstrip in Costa Rica, its own funding. And here is the twist that turned two separate scandals into one giant one. North and a small group of collaborators realized that Iran was paying inflated, marked-up prices for the weapons it was buying, far more than the U.S. government's own cost. That price difference, the markup, created a pool of extra cash. Millions of dollars, sitting in secret accounts, that no one in Congress knew existed. At the suggestion of a Saudi-linked arms dealer and CIA associate named Albert Hakim and retired Air Force General Richard Secord, North allegedly diverted a portion of those profits, reported at the time to be around $3.8 million, later estimated in different ranges by various sources, to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. The very rebels Congress had just voted to cut off. Two illegal operations, funding each other, run out of a windowless office in the White House, without the knowledge of Congress, and, Reagan would later claim, without his own knowledge either. On November 3, 1986, a small pro-Syrian Lebanese magazine called Ash-Shira published a story claiming the United States had been secretly selling arms to Iran, and that former National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane had personally traveled to Tehran to negotiate. The story spread fast. Within days it was picked up by wire services and then American newspapers. Reporters started asking the White House direct questions. And at first, the administration tried to deny it. On November 13, 1986, Reagan addressed the nation on television. He insisted the reports were quite exaggerated and denied trading arms for hostages. It was a claim that would not hold up. Because behind closed doors, something else was happening. Attorney General Edwin Meese had begun an internal review, and his staff found a memo in Oliver North's office. A memo that laid out, in North's own words, the diversion of Iranian arms sale profits to the Contras. According to later congressional testimony, North and his secretary, Fawn Hall, spent days shredding and altering documents once they realized investigators were closing in. Hall would later testify that she smuggled some documents out of the building tucked into her boots and clothing to keep them from being seized. It's one of the most quoted, almost cinematic details of the entire scandal. On November 25, 1986, just 12 days after Reagan's denial, Meese held a press conference and confirmed publicly what the White House had just denied: profits from the Iran arms sales had been diverted to the Contras. Oliver North was fired that same day. National Security Advisor John Poindexter resigned. Reagan reportedly told reporters he had not been fully informed. The question of exactly how much the president knew, and when he knew it, would become the central mystery of the next 2 years. What followed was one of the most significant institutional investigations in modern American history, unfolding on three separate tracks simultaneously. In late 1986, Reagan appointed a special review board, led by former Senator John Tower, to investigate how the National Security Council had operated. Its report, released in February 1987, was damning about the process even if it stopped short of directly accusing Reagan of knowingly authorizing the illegal diversion. It described a National Security Council that had operated with almost no oversight, where a small handful of aides had run a secret foreign policy operation with no formal accountability to anyone. In the summer of 1987, a joint House-Senate committee held televised hearings that captivated the country for weeks. And the breakout figure of those hearings was Oliver North. North, testifying under a grant of limited immunity, did not apologize. He defended the operation as necessary, described himself as a soldier following orders and serving his country, and became, almost overnight, a folk hero to a significant portion of the American public. Telegrams and letters of support reportedly poured into Congress by the tens of thousands. Some polls at the time showed North's public approval climbing even as the committee grilled him. It was a strange moment in American media history, a man testifying about breaking the law, becoming more popular for doing it. Other key witnesses followed. Fawn Hall testified about the document shredding. John Poindexter testified that he had deliberately not told Reagan about the diversion of funds, specifically so the president would have what Poindexter called deniability. That single piece of testimony became one of the most consequential moments of the hearings, because it meant one of two things had to be true: either Reagan really didn't know, and his own staff had operated a secret shadow foreign policy without him, or he did know, and everyone below him was covering for him. Separately, an independent counsel named Lawrence Walsh launched a formal criminal investigation that would run for years, eventually becoming one of the longest and most expensive independent counsel probes in U.S. history, continuing well into the early 1990s. By the time it wrapped up, Walsh's investigation had resulted in charges against 14 people, including North, Poindexter, McFarlane, and several others. Convictions were secured against multiple figures, though a number were later overturned on appeal, largely on the technical grounds that the congressional testimony given under grants of immunity had improperly influenced the criminal trials. This is the question that has never been fully settled, and probably never will be. Reagan's own account shifted over time. In his November 1986 address, he denied any arms for hostages deal outright. By March 1987, in another televised address, his position had changed. He acknowledged that what had started as a strategic opening to Iran had, in his words, deteriorated into an arms for hostages trade, but he maintained he still did not believe that at the time, even though the evidence said otherwise. As he put it in that address, his heart told him one thing, but the facts told him something different. The Tower Commission concluded that Reagan's management style, famously hands-off, delegating heavily to his staff, had allowed a small group of aides to run policy virtually unsupervised. It criticized him for not knowing what his own National Security Council was doing, without concluding he had personally ordered the illegal diversion of funds. Independent Counsel Lawrence Walsh's final report, released years later in 1994, was more pointed. It concluded that Reagan himself had created the conditions that allowed the illegal operations to occur and that senior officials, including then Vice President George H.W. Bush, knew more about the arms sales than they had publicly admitted. But Walsh's investigation never produced hard evidence that Reagan personally authorized the fund diversion to the Contras, the single most illegal part of the entire operation. So the honest answer, even decades later, nobody outside a very small circle knows for certain how much Reagan knew about the diversion specifically. What's not in dispute is that illegal arms sales and an illegal funding scheme for the Contras absolutely happened, under his administration, run by his own staff. Politically, the scandal hit Reagan hard. His approval rating dropped by roughly 20 points in the weeks after the story broke, one of the steepest single drops for a sitting president in the history of polling up to that point. For a time, pundits speculated openly about impeachment. But Reagan survived. He gave his March 1987 speech taking responsibility for the mistakes without fully explaining the diversion, replaced key staff, and largely rode out the remainder of his term with his legacy intact enough that he left office in January 1989 still broadly popular. The people underneath him did not fare as well, at least initially. Oliver North was convicted in 1989 on several charges, including obstructing Congress and destroying documents. His convictions were later vacated on appeal because of the immunity issue. He went on to become a conservative media figure, radio host, and later president of the NRA. John Poindexter was convicted on multiple counts. His convictions were also later overturned on appeal. Robert McFarland pleaded guilty to withholding information from Congress and was later pardoned. Caspar Weinberger, Reagan's Secretary of Defense, was indicted on charges related to concealing documents and lying to investigators. And then, in one of the final and most controversial acts of the entire saga, in December 1992, in his last weeks as president, George H.W. Bush, who had been Reagan's vice president during the scandal, issued pardons to 6 Iran-Contra figures, including Caspar Weinberger, whose trial was scheduled to begin just weeks later. Independent Counsel Lawrence Walsh called the pardons a completion of what he described as a cover-up, arguing they prevented a trial that might have finally exposed exactly how much senior officials, including Bush himself, had known. It remains one of the most debated presidential pardon decisions in American history. Iran-Contra didn't just end careers and dominate headlines for 2 years. It reshaped how Americans thought about presidential power, secrecy, and accountability.